As I record in the middle of May 2025, one of the big questions about the Trump administration is who is running this show? Obviously, it's Donald Trump, right? He is the President of the United States. The executive orders bear his signature. On the other hand, there are an awful lot of things happening in his administration where he doesn't know what's going on, or you need to talk to my lawyers. In this case, meaning the Department of Justice, which, for the record, are supposed to represent the United States itself, not the President of the United States. At a glance, this could be construed as obfuscation, Trump not wanting to answer the question, thereby giving a non-answer. But I would argue it goes deeper than that. On many of these issues, I believe he genuinely does not know what's going on. And not from the usual explanation of mental decline, but because of who is actually in charge of the Trump administration. And who is in charge? Well, let me present the contenders. First up, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., currently the United States Secretary of Health and Human Services and longtime purveyor of anti-vaccine and other conspiracy positions. As the new head of HHS, he has taken a buzzsaw to the agency, firing thousands of people, canceling billions in grants, and forcing out leadership. When questioned about his cuts in interviews, RFK Jr. has seemed unfamiliar with what he has cut and even suggested that if fired staff are actually essential, they could get rehired. On the suggestion of going through each person's job before firing them, Kennedy said, "It takes too long and you lose political momentum." If that sounds like Doge to you, yeah, it does match the strategy of fire first, find out what they did later. And don't worry, we will get back to Doge. There is no question that when it comes to these changes at Health and Human Services, it is RFK Jr. that is making the decisions. Well, some of the cuts were technically Doge. These decisions are not coming from Donald Trump. However, Kennedy only has power and influence over HHS. He isn't the one deciding to gut other government agencies. But as long as he kisses Trump's ring, and until Congress or the courts get involved, the latter of which already has in some cases, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. rules Health and Human Services, but not the White House. Which brings us to number 2 on the list. Elon Musk, the guy put in charge of the misnomer Department of Government Efficiency, i.e. Doge. Or maybe not in charge if you listen to the lawyers attempting to defend Doge's actions in court. At the very least, he's the man who whipped out a chainsaw on stage as a metaphor for the slicing and dicing of various government agencies at his orders. Many of those directives already having been found to be illegal, which has led to many of those fired having to be rehired again. In Musk and Doge's infinite wisdom, they have seen fit to continue to pay some rehired employees without having them return to their jobs. Government efficiency indeed. Others, he, fired actual critical personnel, like those involved in safely transporting and securing the USA's nuclear material. It was very clear that many of Musk's early targets were chosen based on his whims and not the president's. Why target the Federal Aviation Administration right out of the gate? They were investigating SpaceX, owned by Elon Musk. Attempting to shut down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau? That agency's job is to protect consumers from unfair, deceptive, or abusive practices and take action against companies that break the law. Of the more than 30 agencies targeted by Doge, half had active investigations of Elon Musk or his companies. Of course, many of his targets fit into those prescribed by Trump and his campaign. USAID, for instance, being viewed as giving US dollars to foreigners, or the Department of Education, that on the campaign trail was targeted as an agency for elimination. Now, I would argue Musk also had his own reasons for targeting these agencies, especially USAID, but regardless, it could be argued Musk was not making the decisions. But the better argument for Elon Musk not being the puppet master behind the scenes is that he's being shown the door and is stepping down as the leader of Doge. Whether of his own volition is not currently definitive, though he has made public statements about focusing on his businesses. Looking at the reasons for Tesla's free-falling popularity, I'm not sure if Musk is going to be much help there. In the meantime, Doge will be under new management, which brings me to candidate number 3, Russell Vought. I'm sure a lot of you listening to this video reacted to that name by going, who? Vought is considered the architect of Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's blueprint for a right-wing takeover of the executive branch of the US government. The project has as its thesis the idea that the entire executive branch is under the direct control of the president and serves at his whim. So part of that project called for replacing merit-based civil service workers with those loyal to Trump, taking partisan control of agencies such as the Department of Justice and FBI, as well as eliminating other agencies entirely, such as the Department of Education. But back to Russell Vought. He was nominated by Trump and confirmed by the Senate as the director of the Office of Management and Budget before also being named acting head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. In that role, he has suspended all investigations. As director of OMB, he has the responsibility of producing the president's budget, as well as determining whether federal agencies are complying with the president's policies. For someone that was a prominent author of Project 2025, seems to be a position where they could enforce a lot of those ideas, and potentially do so without even talking to the president. Vought is also reportedly slated to gain a new title, Head of Doge. One of the last people I personally want to see with that kind of power, and I'm not alone. Even some Republicans are getting concerned about his increasing influence. Though for some of them, it's because Vought actually wants to cap military spending, which unsurprisingly has put him at odds with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, candidate number 4. Nah, I'm totally kidding. Pete Hegseth has definitely made decisions at the Department of Defense that are based on his own hangups, like firing every admiral and general he can who isn't a white man. But let's be real, he's not the man behind the curtains running the Trump administration. Though if he were, it would explain how he hasn't lost his job yet. On that one, I think it's still just a matter of time. But we continue to serious candidate number 5, Stephen Miller. He is currently the Homeland Security Advisor and Deputy White House Chief of Staff. On entering office, most of the 26 executive orders Trump signed on day one were either drafted or directly coordinated by Miller, most notably the executive order attempting to end birthright citizenship as protected by the US Constitution. As of May 9th, Miller has been publicly touting suspending the writ of habeas corpus, characterizing undocumented immigration as an invasion to justify such a suspension. I quote Miller here. Well, the Constitution is clear, and that, of course, is the supreme law of the land, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion, so it's an option we're actively looking at. Look, a lot of it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not. Now, having said all that, some of you may be wondering, what does this have to do with Stephen Miller being in charge? Because he's the man with the ideas and actively using the authority of the president to enact them. Trump clearly agrees with most of these actions, but they aren't being taken because Trump orders them, but because Miller is. And in cases such as Kilmar Abrego Garcia and the Trump administration's refusal to retrieve him, it is Miller making the decision, not Trump, or even Kristi Noem at Department of Justice. Here, I would argue, is why Trump doesn't know what is going on with the deportations to El Salvador. He isn't making or leading the policy. Miller is. But of course, we can't rule out that Donald Trump is the man ultimately in charge of policy. After all, delegation is a thing, and even the president can't know everything. And when it comes to tariffs, they are clearly his obsession and not anyone else. The painfully obvious self-inflicted economic wounds of putting tariffs on the world would almost certainly not have been made by literally anyone else. Well, maybe Elon Musk. However, the rest of his administration publicly marches to that drumbeat, as that is what is necessary to stay in Trump's good graces. Heck, that one must stay in Trump's good graces would also be evidence of who the man in charge is. Thus far, it's managed to keep Hegseth around. So I circle back to the question, who is in charge of the Trump administration? I gave some of the most likely options. 5 plus Pete Hegseth, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Elon Musk, Russell Vought, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump. My answer as to who is in charge? No one. You didn't hear that wrong. I would argue that there isn't anyone in charge of the Trump administration. In fact, I would argue that there isn't actually a Trump administration. There are various factions that have their respective areas of interest and positions of power that are using Trump's authority and supposed authority to enact their own agendas without the knowledge or previous approval from Trump. So in effect, there isn't one cohesive administration. There are at least half a dozen of them, each with their own pet projects and agendas that often conflict with one another, but all push in the same direction: centralization of power, fascist authoritarianism. This is one component of why this administration is so bumbling and incompetent. Each of these factions are doing their own thing without an overall cohesive plan. Far from the only reason they're incompetent, the main one being that they don't know how a lot of these systems even work, but a reason nonetheless. But it also illustrates why even an incompetent authoritarian government is so dangerous. Even without coordination, even without understanding the systems they wield or wreck, with all these different people pushing in the same direction independently, they can still break the systems that maintain democracy, liberty, and the rule of law. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. If you want to hear me talk about history and politics in the future, hit the subscribe and bell while you're at it. In the meantime, I already have several videos posted for you to enjoy or critique, and I invite your input in the comments below. Until next time, take care.